The cold shock of the wine was immediate, soaking through Zariah Okoye's service vest and turning the crisp white of her apron into a spreading, jagged crimson stain. 1 second, she was a ghost in a black uniform, balancing a silver tray of crystal flutes worth more than her entire year's rent. The next, Isabella Laurent's emerald gown shimmered under the ballroom chandeliers as she tilted her glass with a slow, contemptuous smirk. The clatter of the tray hitting the Italian marble floor echoed like a gunshot through the hall, silencing the whispers of Seoul's most powerful elites. "You filthy, clumsy girl," Isabella's voice dripped with an effortless, practiced venom as she stood over the younger woman, her manicured hand still poised in the air. 200 guests turned to stare at the waitress shivering in the middle of their gala, a Nigerian girl who had spent 8 months trying to be invisible in a city that refused to see her. Isabella didn't notice the way Zariah's hand went instinctively to her collar, nor did she see what was hidden beneath the fabric of the black service uniform. She remained unaware of the glowing platinum ring on a chain around Zariah's neck, a gift from a man whose name makes grown men kneel. And that man, Kang Ji-Hwan, was standing in that very room at that very moment. This is the story of how a girl with nothing became the most protected woman in Seoul. It is for anyone who has ever been underestimated, humiliated, or made to feel small by those who believe they are untouchable. 6 months earlier, Zariah's life had been a different kind of struggle. She had arrived in Seoul from Nairobi with nothing but a single suitcase and a dream, only to find a wall of broken Korean and cold indifference. She worked 3 jobs just to survive, from hotel laundry by day to high-end catering by night. She was always tired, always hungry, and always one mistake away from ruin. Then she found him. It wasn't fate, but a desperate choice made in a dark place. Leaving a late shift at the Imperial Hotel, she discovered a man slumped against a black sedan in the underground garage. His white shirt was soaked with blood and his breathing was shallow. Any sane person would have run, but Zariah had her mother's nursing instincts in her blood. Before we proceed, I would love to know the city you are watching from. Drop it in the comment and also subscribe to this channel if you are new here. The transition from the vibrant chaos of Nairobi to the steel and glass indifference of Seoul had been a slow, freezing realization for Zariah Okoye. In her first weeks, she had walked the streets of Itaewon and Gangnam with her head held high, clutching a suitcase that contained her nursing textbooks and the dreams of a mother who believed the world was wide enough for her daughter's heart. But Seoul did not care for dreams that arrived in broken Korean. It was a city of vertical hierarchies and unspoken rules, a place where the light was reserved for those who already had it, and the shadows were for people like Zariah. To survive, she had mastered the art of becoming a ghost. Her day began at 5 in the morning in the steaming, windowless basement of a hotel laundry, where the scent of chemical bleach and hot iron seeped into her skin. She spent hours folding crisp white linens for guests who would never know her name, her fingers often raw from the heat. There was no time to rest, only the relentless rhythm of the machines and the supervisor's sharp, impatient commands that she understood more by tone than by vocabulary. By the time the sun reached its peak, she was already racing across the city to an office building in the business district, trading her industrial apron for a spray bottle and a cloth. The isolation was a physical ache, a silence that followed her even in the most crowded subway cars. She had no family here, no safety net to catch her if she stumbled, and no connections to bridge the gap between her reality and the life she had envisioned. Her home was a tiny rooftop room that the landlord called an apartment, but it was little more than a box that leaked when the heavy Korean rains hammered against the glass. On those nights, she would sit on her thin mattress, listening to the water drip into a plastic bucket, and wonder if she had made a terrible mistake. Her third and final job was the most punishing, yet it was the one that paid enough to keep the roof over her head. The catering company specialized in high-end events, the kind of galas where the champagne cost more than her monthly rent. It was here that the invisibility was most profound. She would dress in the black long-sleeve uniform, pull her hair into a neat puff bun, and move through rooms filled with the wealthy and powerful. She learned to read the subtle shifts in the air, the way guests looked through her as if she were a piece of the furniture, or the way Isabella Laurent and her circle would wave her away like she was a common insect. Zariah was tired, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that sleep could no longer touch. She told herself it was temporary, a bridge to a better future, but the bridge felt like it was lengthening every day. She lived for the small moments, the taste of a cheap meal after a 16-hour shift, or the rare phone calls home where she would lie and tell her family that Seoul was as beautiful and welcoming as they had imagined. She kept her mother's nursing instincts tucked away like a secret, using her scarf to wipe the brow of a fellow worker or offering a steady hand to a kitchen porter who tripped in the rush. She was a stranger in a land that prized homogeneity, a black girl navigating a world of rigid expectations. Every day was a battle against the desire to simply disappear, to let the weight of the 3 jobs and the crushing solitude pull her under. But she continued to move, a silent shadow in the ballroom, unaware that the invisibility she used as a shield was about to be shattered by a man bleeding in a dark garage. The shift at the Imperial Hotel had ended like all the others, with a hollow ache in Zariah's lower back and the cold realization that she still had a 40-minute walk ahead of her. The underground parking garage was a cavern of concrete and flickering fluorescent hums, smelling of damp earth and expensive exhaust. Zariah kept her head down, her steps quick and rhythmic, practicing the invisibility that had become her primary survival skill in Seoul. She was nearly at the exit ramp when a metallic thud echoed through the silence, followed by the wet, ragged sound of a struggle for air. She stopped, her pulse jumping against the base of her throat. Most people in this city would have kept walking, eyes fixed forward to avoid a complication that didn't belong to them. But Zariah's feet moved toward the sound before her mind could protest. Slumped against the rear tire of a sleek black sedan was a man. His crisp white shirt was ruined, a deep crimson stain spreading across the ribs, looking almost black under the dim garage lights. His breathing was shallow, his eyes half closed as he fought to stay upright. Zariah knelt beside him, the cold concrete biting into her knees. Her mother's voice, calm and instructional, whispered in the back of her head. Nursing was a legacy she carried in her marrow, even if she had never been allowed to finish her degrees. She didn't ask who he was or how he had been hurt. Instead, she unwound the heavy scarf from her neck, her hands shaking as she pressed the fabric firmly against the wound in his side. "Stay with me," she whispered in English, her voice trembling but steady in its intent. She tried to remember the Korean words for "don't die," fumbling through her limited vocabulary to keep him tethered to the world. The man looked at her then, really looked at her, his dark eyes sharp and piercingly aware despite the blood loss. He wasn't just a victim, he was a predator assessing a sudden, unexpected variable. "You're not afraid," he said, his voice a deep, calm rasp in perfect English. "I am," Zariah admitted, her fingers stained red as she maintained the pressure. "But you're bleeding." For a long moment, the air between them was thick with a tension that surpassed the injury. Then, the man gave a single, imperceptible nod, a silent permission for her to enter his life. Zariah helped him into the back seat of the sedan, her strength surprising her as she hauled his dead weight into the vehicle. She climbed into the driver's seat, her hands gripping the leather steering wheel. She didn't have a license in this country, and she had never driven a car this powerful, but the urgency of the blood on her hands made the law feel like a distant, irrelevant memory. "Drive," he commanded, giving her an address in Gangnam instead of a hospital. Zariah threw the car into gear, the engine roaring to life with a predatory growl. She drove like she had stolen the machine, weaving through the neon-drenched arteries of Seoul with a frantic, focused precision. Beside her, the man stayed conscious through sheer, terrifying willpower, his eyes tracking the blurred lights of the city as they raced toward the towering glass structures of the wealthy district. As she pulled up to the address, a looming monolith of black glass, the car was immediately swarmed by men in dark suits who moved with military efficiency. They pulled him from the back seat, and for a second, Zariah felt the sudden, cold vacuum of her old life rushing back in to meet her. She was just a waitress again, a girl with blood on her scarf and no place in this world of glass and steel. But as they carried him toward the entrance, Kang Ji-Hwan turned his head, his gaze locking onto hers one last time. "Your name?" he asked, his voice a low vibration that seemed to anchor her to the spot. "Zariah," she managed to say. A small, dangerous smile touched his lips, a look that promised she was no longer invisible. "I'll remember." For 2 weeks, the underground garage of the Imperial Hotel felt like a tomb of secrets Zariah was forced to visit every night. She scrubbed the floors and folded the linens, her mind constantly replaying the phantom sensation of blood on her hands and the weight of a dying man against her shoulder. She had expected the police to find her, or perhaps the men in suits to return to ensure her silence, but there was only an oppressive, ringing void. The invisibility she had cultivated for 8 months felt thinner now, as if the dangerous smile Kang Ji-Hwan had given her had permanently altered the way the light hit her skin. Then, a black car appeared outside her rooftop room, idling under the leak in the ceiling like a silent predator. A man in a tailored suit handed her an envelope stuffed with enough cash to pay her rent for a year and a note in clean, sharp handwriting that simply said, "For the hospital bill I didn't pay. And for your courage." Zariah should have taken the money and vanished back into the shadows of the hotel laundry, but the curiosity was a fire she couldn't extinguish. When she asked the hotel security about the man from the garage, the fear in their eyes was the only answer she needed. "That man is not someone you want to know," an older guard whispered, pulling her into a corner. "Kang Ji-Hwan runs the half of Seoul the police are too afraid to talk about." Her blood went cold, yet her heart refused to listen. 3 days later, the shadow of Seoul appeared in her world. Zariah was mid-shift at her second job, scrubbing the marble floors of an office building at 2 a.m. when the elevator chimed. She looked up to see Ji-Hwan standing at the end of the hallway, looking like a god of glass and steel in a black suit that cost more than her entire life. His wound was healed, and his presence filled the empty corridor with a suffocating, magnetic authority. "You're hard to find, Zariah," he said, his voice a deep, calm rasp. "I'm just a cleaner," she replied, her voice shaking as she gripped her mop like a weapon. "Why are you here?" "Because you saved my life and didn't ask for anything," he said, stepping closer until she could smell the expensive cedar and the metallic hint of power that clung to him. "That's unusual. Now have dinner with me." Zariah laughed, a jagged sound in the empty hallway. "I can't. I have another shift starting in 4 hours." Ji-Hwan didn't argue. He simply pulled out a sleek phone and made a single 30-second call. Moments later, Zariah's supervisor called, his voice trembling as he told her she had the night off, fully paid. She stared at Ji-Hwan, the realization of his reach hitting her like a physical blow. He wasn't asking, he was rewriting her reality. He took her to a private restaurant perched high above the city, a place where the waiters bowed so low their foreheads nearly touched the floor. For the first time, Zariah wasn't the one serving the champagne. She was the one holding the crystal flute. Ji-Hwan didn't talk about the blood or the men in suits. Instead, he asked about Nairobi, about her mother's nursing, and about the dreams she had carried in her single suitcase. He listened with a focus that was terrifying in its intensity, not like the wealthy men at the galas who looked through her, but like a man who found her words more valuable than the gold on the walls. By the end of the night, as they watched the Han River glitter like a vein of spilled diamonds, Ji-Hwan leaned forward. "You're not afraid of me," he noted. "Should I be?" Zariah asked, meeting his sharp, dark eyes. "Yes," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Because I'm not a good man, Zariah. I've done things that would make you run." Zariah looked at the man who had forced the world to give her a moment of peace, and for the first time in Seoul, she didn't feel like a ghost. "Then prove me wrong," she whispered. "Be better." A shift moved through his expression, a flicker of something human behind the iron mask, and Zariah realized she had just invited a dragon to sit at her table. In the weeks that followed their first dinner, the secret of Kang Ji-Hwan became a dark, magnetic pull in Zariah's life. They began seeing each other in the quiet, liminal hours of the Seoul night, far from the prying eyes of the catering managers and the harsh fluorescent lights of the hotel laundry. He was a man of immense, quiet power who lived in a world of absolute authority, yet when he was with her, the iron mask he wore for the city seemed to soften. He moved her out of the leaking rooftop room in Itaewon and into a safe, modern apartment where the rain no longer dripped into plastic buckets, and he quietly paid off the debts that had been a noose around her neck for months. For the first time since she had arrived in Korea, Zariah felt like she mattered, not as a servant or a ghost, but as a woman. However, the reality of who he was could not be scrubbed away as easily as the grime on an office floor. One evening, as they walked along a secluded stretch of the Han River, the shadow of Seoul finally allowed the truth to breathe. He spoke of his empire not as a collection of investments, but as a network of trade routes, information, and protection services that decided who succeeded and who simply disappeared in the dark. He was a man who ruled through fear because he had earned it, and his hands, which touched her with such impossible gentleness, had done things in the shadows that she couldn't begin to imagine. "I told you I was not a good man, Zariah," he reminded her, his voice a low, somber vibration. "The things I control, the people I command. It is a world built on blood and hard choices." Zariah looked at him, the neon skyline of Seoul reflecting in his sharp, dark eyes. Every instinct she had cultivated for survival screamed at her to run, to take the safety he had provided and vanish before the predator's heart turned its cold focus on her. Any sane person would have left, but as she searched his face, she didn't see the king the world feared. She saw the man who had sat across from her at dinner and truly listened. He didn't listen to her stories about Nairobi or her mother with the distracted indulgence of a powerful man waiting for his turn to speak. He listened as if her words were the only anchor he had in a life made of lies and violence. He knew the color of her mother's favorite scarf and the exact degree of the dream she had carried in her single suitcase. In a city that had treated her like an insect, he treated her like a person whose every thought carried the weight of absolute truth. "Why me, Ji-Hwan?" she asked, her voice steady despite the chill of the river breeze. "You have everything. Why choose someone who has nothing?" "Because everyone else is afraid of what I can do to them," he replied, stepping closer until his shadow completely enveloped her. "You are the only one who cares about what I am." Zariah realized then that she was falling in love with a monster, but it was a monster who was tired of being feared and never known. She chose to stay, not for the security or the apartment, but for the man who saw her clearly in a world that insisted she remain invisible. She told herself she didn't need to know every dark detail of his business as long as the heart he showed her remained true. It was a dangerous gamble, a choice to walk beside a dragon, but as his hand found hers in the dark, she knew she had already found the only light she ever wanted to keep. 3 months into their hidden romance, Kang Ji-Hwan led Zariah to a private rooftop as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and liquid gold. Below them, the Han River glittered like a vein of spilled diamonds, a silent witness to a man who ruled the darkness and the woman who had become his only light. The air was crisp, carrying the distant, low hum of a city that had no idea its most dangerous king was currently vulnerable. Ji-Hwan didn't speak for a long time, his sharp eyes softened as he watched Zariah take in the view. When he finally moved, it was to pull a small black box from his jacket. "I know what you're going to say," he began, his voice a steady, certain vibration that anchored her to the spot. "That it's too soon, that you don't know everything about me, and that being with me is a risk you shouldn't have to take." He opened the box to reveal a platinum ring, simple and perfect, its diamond catching the dying light with a fierce, cold brilliance. "But I've lived my entire life in shadows, Zariah. You're the only thing I've ever wanted to keep." Zariah felt her throat tighten as she looked at the ring. She should have asked more questions about the trade routes and the people who feared his name, but when she looked at him, she only saw the man who had cleaned her hands and listened to her dreams. She said yes, the word a soft vow that felt like both a beginning and a surrender. However, the reality of Ji-Hwan's world remained a jagged edge. He insisted that the engagement remain private for her safety, fearing that his enemies would see her as a target to exploit his only weakness. Zariah didn't argue with the secrecy, but she made a choice that surprised him. She refused to stop working her catering shifts. She didn't want to become a trophy kept in a gilded cage, nor did she want to be the woman who gave up her independence for a man's empire. "I want to earn my own way, Ji-Hwan," she told him, her voice firm despite the luxury of the new apartment he had provided. "I need to know I can still stand on my own 2 feet." He had looked at her with a mix of frustration and profound respect before relenting. He allowed her to keep her jobs, but he placed a delicate platinum chain around her neck, sliding the engagement ring onto it so she could wear it beneath her uniform, close to her heart and hidden from the world. It became her glowing secret, a hidden weight that reminded her of the dragon's devotion even as she scrubbed floors and served champagne to people who looked through her as if she were made of glass. Zariah returned to her shifts at the hotel and the grand ballrooms, moving like a ghost through the crowds of Seoul's wealthiest elites. She felt the cool metal of the ring against her skin whenever she reached to adjust her white collar, a silent promise that her invisibility was now a choice, not a sentence. She was still the poor African waitress to the rest of the world, just another face in the service industry that paid the best but treated workers the worst. But as she balanced her heavy silver trays, she knew that she was the most protected woman in the city. She was engaged to a man whose name made grown men kneel, and though she was kneeling in champagne and shattered dreams for now, she was only waiting for the moment she would finally stand. Kang Ji-Hwan, the Seoul philanthropic gala, was a sea of shimmering silk, sharp tuxedos, and the heavy, cloying scent of status. For Zariah, it was supposed to be the final shift of a long week, another night of moving like a shadow through a room full of people who refused to see her. She adjusted her white apron, feeling the familiar, grounding weight of the platinum ring against her chest, hidden safely beneath the fabric of her black catering uniform. The ballroom was filled with 400 of the city's most influential figures, but Zariah kept her eyes lowered, focusing on the silver tray of red wine she carried with practiced grace. She was moving toward the VIP section when she saw Isabella Laurent. Dressed in a luxurious emerald green gown that seemed to glow under the crystal chandeliers, Isabella stood with a group of socialites, her laughter sharp and hollow. She was known for her emerald viper reputation, a woman who treated service staff as if they were disposable insects. As Zariah approached to offer a refill, Isabella's gaze flicked over her with a cold, unmistakable contempt. "I didn't ask for more," Isabella hissed, waving her hand dismissively as if Zariah were a nuisance. Zariah began to step back, murmuring a polite apology, but the space was tight. Another server, rushing to clear an empty table, bumped into Zariah's shoulder. It was a split-second accident, but it was enough. The tray tilted, and a few drops of deep red wine splashed onto the shimmering hem of Isabella's emerald gown. The silence that followed was instantaneous and suffocating. "You ruined it," Isabella whispered, her voice trembling with a rage that felt entirely out of proportion to the minor stain. "Do you have any idea how much this costs? More than you'll make in a lifetime of scrubbing floors." Zariah stood her ground, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. It was an accident." She never finished the sentence. Isabella's arm moved in a blur of green silk, and the wine glass she was holding wasn't just emptied. It was dumped deliberately and slowly over Zariah's head. The cold, dark liquid soaked through Zariah's hair, clouded her vision, and drenched her white apron in a jagged crimson stain. The clatter of the silver tray hitting the marble floor echoed like a gunshot, but no one moved to help. The 200 elites in the immediate vicinity froze, watching the poor African waitress stand humiliated in the center of their beautiful gala. Isabella leaned in, her manicured hand trembling with entitlement. "Get out!" she hissed, her voice carrying across the silent room. "You don't belong here. You are filth." Zariah wiped the wine from her eyes, her vision blurring not from tears, but from the sheer shock of the violation. She looked around the room, seeing faces filled with pity, disgust, or worst of all, utter indifference. She felt small, exposed, and entirely alone. But then her hand instinctively went to her collar, feeling the hard, cool shape of the platinum ring beneath her uniform. At that moment, the heavy double doors at the end of the hall opened. The crowd parted naturally, not because of a request, but because of the sheer weight of the authority walking through the room. Kang Ji-Hwan entered, his black suit fitting him like armor, his expression a mask of terrifying, silent calm. He didn't look at the politicians or the billionaires vying for his attention. His eyes were locked on the woman standing in a pool of red wine and shattered dignity. The elite guests held their collective breath, unaware that the Emerald Viper had just struck the only person in the world who could make the dragon burn the entire room to the ground. Kang Ji-Hwan's footsteps were slow, deliberate, and carried the weight of a death sentence. The crowd of Seoul's elite, who had been whispering and snickering moments ago, scrambled to get out of his path as he moved through the ballroom like a storm front. He didn't acknowledge the politicians or the CEOs. His entire world had narrowed down to the woman standing in the center of the floor, drenched in red wine and surrounded by the mocking silence of the highborn. Isabella Laurent, still flushed with the adrenaline of her cruelty, didn't recognize the danger until it was inches from her. She smoothed her emerald gown, a triumphant smirk still playing on her lips. "Mr. Kang," she began, her voice pitching up into a flirtatious, respectful tone. "I'm so sorry you had to witness such a—" Ji-Hwan didn't even look at her. He bypassed Isabella entirely and stopped in front of Zariah. The room went so quiet that the only sound was the rhythmic drip of wine falling from Zariah's apron onto the marble. Ji-Hwan reached out, his massive hands moving with a tenderness that made the onlookers gasp. He cupped Zariah's face, his thumb gently wiping a stray drop of crimson from her cheek. "Are you hurt?" he asked. His voice was soft, a private low vibration intended only for her ears, yet it carried an intensity that chilled everyone else in the room. Zariah shook her head, her breath hitching. She felt the heat radiating from him, a protective barrier against the cold indifference of the crowd. She watched as his gaze shifted from her face to the wine-soaked front of her uniform. His jaw tightened, a small muscle jumping in his cheek, the only sign of the absolute rage boiling beneath his controlled exterior. He stood up straight and finally turned to Isabella. The socialite stumbled back, the smirk vanishing as she was hit by the full force of his dark, predatory eyes. "Apologize," Ji-Hwan said. The word was quiet, but it landed with the force of a physical blow. Isabella let out a sharp, nervous laugh. "Excuse me, Mr. Kang, she's just a waitress. She ruined my dress." "Do you know who I am?" "I know exactly who you are," Ji-Hwan replied, his tone devoid of any emotion. "And I know that you just put your hands on my fiancé." The word fiancé rippled through the ballroom like an explosion. Shocked gasps and frantic whispers erupted as Ji-Hwan reached into Zariah's collar. With a single, fluid motion, he pulled the platinum chain from beneath her uniform, holding up the glowing ring for the entire room to see. The diamond caught the chandelier light, its brilliance an undeniable proof of his claim. "This woman is mine," he announced, his voice now projecting to every corner of the gala. "And since you don't know how to treat a guest of this house, you will be removed." "You can't do that," Isabella shrieked, her face turning a ghastly shade of white as security guards, men in Ji-Hwan's own black suits, began to close in. "My father is a board member. I belong here." "I own this hotel," Ji-Hwan countered, his voice rising in authority. "I own the catering firm you insulted. I own the very floor you are standing on. And as of this moment, you are banned from every property and business I control." He looked at the trembling socialite with utter disdain. "In this city, Isabella, that means you no longer have a place to go." As the guards hauled a screaming Isabella toward the exit, the rest of the guests turned away, suddenly terrified to meet Zariah's eyes. Ji-Hwan didn't wait for their excuses. He held out his hand to Zariah, his expression softening as he looked back at her. "Let's go home," he whispered. Zariah took his hand, her fingers stained with wine but her heart finally steady. She walked out of the gala not as a waitress, but as a queen, leaving the shattered glass and the emerald viper behind in the dark. The morning after the gala, the city of Seoul woke to a silent, systematic erasure of the Laurent name. Within hours of Kang Ji-Hwan's decree, the social execution of Isabella was no longer just a threat made in a ballroom. It was a cold, mathematical reality. Isabella had once believed her status was an impenetrable shield, a birthright that allowed her to treat others like insects, but she had failed to realize that the ground she stood on was owned by the very man she had insulted. In the high-rise offices of the Laurent family's holdings, Phones began to ring with the kind of news that turns empires into dust. Ji-Hwan didn't use a scalpel. He used a sledgehammer. With a single series of phone calls, Isabella was blacklisted from every luxury hotel, every private club, and every high-end boutique in the East Asian infrastructure network. Her credit lines, managed by banks that valued Ji-Hwan's security services over Isabella's old money lineage, were frozen without explanation. By noon, the invitations to the upcoming season's most exclusive events were rescinded, and her social media, once a platform for her vanity, became a graveyard of deleted connections as her friends scrambled to distance themselves from a woman who had become a liability. Ji-Hwan sat in his private study, the morning light catching the sharp edges of his tailored suit as he reviewed the final reports. He wasn't a man who enjoyed cruelty for its own sake, but he was a man who believed in the absolute weight of consequences. Isabella hadn't just spilled wine. She had attempted to destroy the dignity of the only person who made his world worth living in. To him, her social removal was a necessary hygiene, a clearing of the path for the woman who would soon rule beside him. Zariah stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, watching the city pulse below. She was no longer wearing the stained black uniform or the white apron of a servant. She was dressed in silk that felt like a second skin, yet she still felt the phantom sting of the wine on her face. When Ji-Hwan approached her, his presence was a grounding force, his massive hands resting gently on her shoulders. "It's done," he said softly, his voice devoid of the iron he had used in the ballroom. "She will never be able to step into your light again." Zariah leaned back against him, feeling the steady beat of a heart that the world considered made of stone. She thought about Isabella, who was likely currently discovering that her name no longer opened doors, and then she thought about the thousands of other workers who were still invisible, still kneeling in the shattered glass of someone else's ego. "Some people only learn through consequences," Ji-Hwan reminded her, repeating the words that defined his reign. He didn't want her to feel pity. He wanted her to feel the weight of the protection he had promised her. He had spent his life in darkness so that he could ensure no one would ever make her feel small again. As the news outlets began to run the headline of the billionaire investor publicly claiming his African fiancée, the shift in power was complete. Isabella Laurent had been erased, not by a slap or a spill, but by the silent command of a king who refused to flinch. Zariah realized then that she wasn't just safe, she was significant. The girl from Nairobi had become a partner to the shadow, and as she looked at the engagement ring now worn openly on her finger, she knew that the world would never be able to look through her again. A month after the echoes of the gala had faded into the annals of Seoul's most whispered scandals, the city gathered again, not for a philanthropic farce, but for a private ceremony that redefined the meaning of power. The wedding took place on a secluded estate overlooking the Han River, the water glittering like liquid obsidian under a canopy of stars. Zariah Okoye stood at the edge of the terrace, no longer a ghost in a catering uniform, but a woman draped in a gown of ivory silk that flowed like water against her deep, radiant skin. The platinum ring, once hidden on a secret chain, now sat firmly on her finger, its brilliance a permanent seal of the dragon's protection. Kang Ji-Hwan approached her, his presence as commanding as ever, yet his eyes held a softness reserved only for the woman who had saved him in a dark garage. He didn't see a poor waitress or a social project. He saw a partner who had looked into his darkness and asked him to be better. As they exchanged vows, it wasn't a fairy tale of a princess being rescued, but a pact between two equals, one who ruled the shadows and one who brought the light. He had spent his life earning the fear of the city, but in Zariah, he had found the only person he was truly afraid of losing. The marriage was only the beginning of their shared reign. Zariah refused to let her new status be a gilded cage. Instead, she used the vast resources of Ji-Hwan's infrastructure network to give a voice to those who remained invisible. On the day of their first anniversary, they stood together at the opening of the Okoye Foundation, a sanctuary and advocacy center for immigrant workers in Korea. The building was a marvel of glass and steel, funded by Ji-Hwan's empire, but guided by Zariah's heart. She walked through the halls, greeting the cleaners, the laundry workers, and the servers with a dignity that commanded the room. She spoke to them in the fluent Korean she had once struggled to master, promising them that they would no longer have to navigate the city without a safety net. Behind her, Ji-Hwan stood like a silent sentinel, his authority ensuring that no Isabella Laurent would ever dare to step foot near her work again. He had learned to use his power not just to destroy, but to build the world his wife envisioned. As the sun set over the city, Zariah looked at her husband and realized that the mistake in the parking garage had been the most intentional moment of her life. She was no longer a stranger in a cold land, and she was no longer tired. She was the most dangerous woman in Seoul, not because she carried a weapon, but because she carried the absolute devotion of a king and the unbreakable spirit of a survivor. If her story reminded the world of anything, it was that real love meant seeing someone fully and choosing them anyway, and that those who are underestimated often end up being the ones who reign.